The night was buzzing with excitement. For weeks, fans of Jimmy Kimmel Live had been eagerly anticipating the appearance of Keanu Reeves, the beloved actor known for his roles in films like The Matrix and John Wick. Keanu had always been a bit of an enigma in Hollywood, famous yet remarkably humble and private. His down-to-earth nature had made him a fan favorite, and his interviews were usually smooth sailing. People didn't expect any drama when Keanu was around, especially not in the chaotic world of late-night talk shows. As the studio lights dimmed and the audience settled into their seats, the excitement in the air was palpable. The crew worked in perfect sync, getting everything ready for the show to start. The stage was set, and the warm-up comedian had the crowd laughing and clapping. All of this was just a precursor to what everyone believed would be another fun, laid-back episode of the show. After all, Keanu had never been one to stir up controversy. The show started with Jimmy Kimmel's usual charm. The host, known for his sharp wit and light-hearted humor, greeted the audience, cracking a few jokes to loosen everyone up. His warm-up acts were always a hit, but tonight, it felt like everyone was waiting for the main event. Jimmy made a quick joke about Keanu's famous niceness, a trait that had made him a symbol of kindness in an often cynical industry. The audience chuckled, knowing it was all in good fun. It was the kind of playful jab Keanu had become accustomed to over the years. The excitement only grew as the show's opening music played, signaling that it was time for Keanu to make his entrance. The lights flashed and the audience cheered as Keanu walked onto the stage. He was dressed in his usual understated style, a black suit jacket over a simple shirt, his hair slightly tousled but still effortlessly cool. As he walked toward Jimmy, the crowd erupted in applause. Keanu smiled warmly, waving as he made his way to the chair across from the host. The energy in the room was infectious. Keanu sat down, adjusting his jacket and offering a polite smile to Jimmy. It was clear from the way he carried himself that he was calm and collected, his usual quiet charm radiating from him. There was something about Keanu that made him seem so real, so grounded. Even in the world of Hollywood glitz and glamour, he had managed to stay true to himself. His humility was a breath of fresh air for fans who had grown used to the egos of other celebrities. "Keanu, thank you so much for being here," Jimmy said, his voice warm but with that characteristic sharpness. "I have to say, it's not every day we get to sit down with someone who's not only a huge star, but also the nicest guy in Hollywood." Keanu laughed softly, a genuine chuckle. "I'm just doing my job, Jimmy," he said, his voice calm but with a hint of humor. "I don't know about the nicest, but I do try to be kind." The crowd responded with another round of applause. It was always nice to hear someone so famous talk with such humility. They settled into their conversation, the usual banter about Keanu's past roles and his more recent work in the John Wick series. Everyone was comfortable and the mood felt light. Jimmy, as always, teased Keanu about some of his more iconic moments, like the crazy fight scenes from his action movies, and Keanu responded with his usual coolness, laughing off the jokes and playing along. It was clear that Keanu was at ease on the show and the audience loved it. But even with all the light-hearted jokes, there was a sense that something more serious was just beneath the surface. Keanu's latest movie, an intense action thriller, had been met with mixed reactions. While many praised it for its thrilling pace and breathtaking stunts, others were quick to criticize its violent content. The film had sparked some controversy, with people wondering if Keanu, known for his thoughtful and kind nature, was stepping into a more aggressive, intense role for the wrong reasons. At first, Jimmy didn't touch on these sensitive subjects, sticking to safe topics. But as the conversation progressed, Jimmy began to push the envelope a little bit. He couldn't help himself. After all, he was the master of getting people to reveal more than they intended. It was his job to dig a little deeper and get the juicy details that the audience was always dying to know. "So, Keanu," Jimmy began, leaning forward slightly, his voice playful, "this new movie of yours, I've got to say, it's a bit intense. You've been known for playing the calm, collected hero, but this time, it feels like we're seeing a whole new side of you." Keanu's expression didn't change, but his smile faded slightly. He had heard the same questions a million times before. He was used to people asking about his transition from the calm, philosophical figure in The Matrix to the brutal, action-packed killer in John Wick, but tonight, something about Jimmy's tone felt a little off, almost like he was trying to provoke him. Still, Keanu maintained his usual cool demeanor. It's just a role, Jimmy, Keanu said softly, his voice measured. I take it seriously, but it's all part of the job. It's not about me personally. It's about the character and the story. Jimmy nodded, but the smile on his face didn't quite reach his eyes. Yeah, but come on, you've got to admit there's something a little, well, dark about it. I mean, you've gone from saving the world from machines to what? Fighting for your life in some pretty grim situations. What made you decide to take on something so intense? Keanu paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. It was a typical Jimmy move. Tease the guest a little, push them to explain themselves. But this time, Keanu wasn't sure if Jimmy was genuinely curious or if he was just trying to stir things up. Still, he held his ground. The story interested me, Keanu said, keeping his voice even. The character had depth and the themes were something I could relate to. It's not just about the action. It's about what drives the character. His struggle. That's what drew me in. The audience was listening intently, but there was an undercurrent of tension starting to build. It wasn't obvious, but Keanu's usual calm was starting to show cracks. Jimmy, sensing that he might be pushing a little too hard, decided to shift gears, at least for the moment. Well, I'll tell you one thing, Jimmy said with a grin. If anyone can pull off a role like that, it's you, Keanu. I mean, who else could make running around with guns and fighting for your life look so cool? Keanu chuckled, his mood lightening for a moment. I just do what the character needs, Jimmy. But even as the conversation continued, there was a subtle shift in the air. Keanu was trying his best to keep things light, but there was a sense that the questions were starting to dig a little too deep. The crowd was still engaged, still laughing at the jokes, but everyone could feel the tension just below the surface. Keanu had always been an enigma, and tonight it seemed like there was more going on than anyone expected. As the conversation moved on, Keanu's responses became more careful. He wasn't angry, but he was clearly guarded. Jimmy, sensing a shift in the energy, pressed on with his questions, trying to keep the flow of the conversation going. He was trying to navigate the tricky waters of talking to a celebrity with so many layers. But it was becoming clear that Keanu wasn't as eager to open up as he usually was. For a moment, the audience wondered if something bigger was brewing. Was this going to be just another fun interview, or was something about to happen that would shake things up? Little did they know, things were about to take a turn that no one saw coming. The conversation started to settle into a more comfortable rhythm. The playful banter between Jimmy and Keanu was beginning to feel like the kind of casual chat the audience had expected from the very beginning. Keanu, always the professional, gave the impression that he was willing to go with the flow, no matter how many personal questions Jimmy threw his way. It wasn't that Keanu was uncomfortable, but there was something in his eyes now. A small flicker of hesitation, as though he knew where this conversation was headed. Jimmy, however, was a master at his craft. He knew how to keep a guest on their toes, to make them laugh and think at the same time. And he certainly wasn't going to let Keanu slip away without digging a little deeper. The audience, too, was captivated by the exchange, hanging on every word. After all, Keanu Reeves wasn't just an actor. He was a cultural icon, and anyone who had watched him on screen over the years knew that there was something undeniably intriguing about his calm demeanor. It was a quality that made him stand out in Hollywood, where so many stars played up their own eccentricities. But Keanu never really needed to do that. He was always simply himself. So, Keanu, Jimmy said with that familiar twinkle in his eye, I have to ask because people are always curious. How do you manage to keep such a low profile? I mean, you're one of the biggest stars in the world, but you don't seem to get caught up in all the Hollywood chaos. The question was straightforward enough, but there was something behind it that made the audience sit up straighter. Jimmy's tone, light but probing, had a way of making guests feel like they were under a microscope. And tonight it seemed that Keanu was the one who was being observed more than usual. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He wasn't rushing to answer. The question itself wasn't anything new. He had been asked a version of it countless times over the years. But tonight it felt different. Tonight the stakes were higher. Something was hanging in the air, an unspoken tension that had been slowly building as the interview went on. Well, Keanu began, his voice steady but quieter than usual. I've always believed in keeping things simple. The less you let outside stuff affect you, the more room you have for what really matters. He paused, almost as if thinking out loud. There's a lot of noise in the world, especially in this business. But I try to focus on what I love to do, making movies, sharing stories, and connecting with people. I guess the rest just doesn't interest me all that much. The audience nodded, impressed by the sincerity in Keanu's words. They had heard this kind of answer before, but it never seemed rehearsed. It was genuine, coming from someone who seemed to truly live by these principles. Still, there was something in the air, like the calm before a storm, and Keanu's words only seemed to make it more intense. Jimmy could sense it too. The usual easygoing nature of the conversation was slipping away, and he felt the need to lighten things up again. So, as he always did, he attempted to steer the conversation in a different direction with one of his classic jokes. "Okay, but let's be real, Keanu," Jimmy said with a grin. "You're telling me there's never been a time when you've wanted to, I don't know, throw a chair at a paparazzo or do something wild just to get a little attention?" The crowd laughed, their energy rising once again. It was the kind of playful teasing Jimmy excelled at. Keanu, however, didn't immediately laugh this time. Instead, he looked at Jimmy for a moment, considering the question. "I've never really felt the need to do something like that," Keanu replied thoughtfully, his voice calm but with a slight edge that hadn't been there before. "I think if you're focusing on being true to yourself, those kinds of distractions don't hold much weight. It's easy to get caught up in the noise, but I think there's more to life than that." Jimmy's grin faltered for just a moment. The tension that had been growing between them was beginning to show. This was the point where Jimmy usually cracked a quick joke to diffuse any awkwardness, but he could tell that Keanu wasn't quite in the mood for jokes anymore. The shift was subtle, but it was there. Jimmy, always quick on his feet, tried to lighten the mood by changing the subject again. All right, let's move on," he said, his voice back to its usual playful tone. "Let's talk about your latest movie. It's getting so much buzz, but not everyone is a fan of the violence in it. I've heard some people say it's too intense. What do you think about that?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Keanu's eyes darkened just slightly, and the room seemed to grow quieter. This wasn't the first time he had been asked about the film's violent content, but something about the way Jimmy phrased it felt more critical than usual. Keanu didn't immediately answer, his eyes flickering for a second as though he was carefully choosing his words. "I think people often misunderstand why violence is in films like this," Keanu said, his voice still even but now with a firmness that hadn't been there before. "It's not about glorifying it. It's about showing the consequences of violence. The character I play is not someone who takes pleasure in hurting others. He's been forced into a situation where violence becomes a necessary evil. I think the film's deeper message is about the cost of living that way, not about celebrating it." Jimmy nodded slowly, but there was still a certain tension in the air. "Yeah, I get that," he said, his voice taking on a slightly more serious tone. "But there's always that question. Why take on these roles? I mean, you've built this image of being the nice guy, the calm guy, the guy who's always zen. Was it hard for you to step into a role that's so, well, far from that?" Keanu took a deep breath before responding. "It wasn't about the image, Jimmy. It was about the story and the character. When you read a script, you have to see beyond what the character is doing. It's about understanding their journey, what they're going through. For me, it was a challenge I was willing to take on. But that doesn't mean I'm changing who I am. I'm still the same person no matter what role I play." The room had gone quiet. The audience, who had been laughing and clapping just moments before, was now absorbed in the conversation. Keanu's words had struck a chord, and the atmosphere had shifted once again. Jimmy, for all his usual charisma and quick wit, was suddenly at a loss for words. This wasn't the easygoing, light-hearted interview he had expected. Jimmy cleared his throat, trying to regain some control over the situation. "Well, I mean, that makes sense, I guess. But I don't know, Keanu. It's hard to imagine you as the guy who's kicking down doors and taking out bad guys left and right." He tried to make it sound like a joke, but it was clear from the look on Keanu's face that the moment had passed. Keanu wasn't laughing, and it seemed like the more Jimmy tried to push, the more Keanu was pulling back. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "I understand what you're saying, Jimmy, but I think it's important to recognize that not every character I play is a reflection of who I am. Sometimes it's about stepping into someone else's shoes and seeing the world from their perspective. That's what acting is. It's not about being the nice guy or the tough guy. It's about telling a story." There was a moment of silence. Keanu's words hung in the air, and the crowd seemed to realize that this was no longer just an interview about a movie. It was about something deeper, something that Jimmy hadn't quite expected. For the first time that evening, it seemed like the conversation was veering into territory that neither Keanu nor Jimmy were entirely comfortable navigating. And though the audience didn't know it yet, this was the moment when everything was about to change. The tension in the room was growing. What had started as a light-hearted and fun interview was now turning into something entirely different. Keanu's responses were becoming more measured, and Jimmy's usual quick wit seemed to be faltering. It wasn't that either of them had lost their composure, but there was an unmistakable shift in the energy between them. The audience, sensing the change, grew more silent, hanging on to every word, unsure of where this conversation was heading. Jimmy, never one to shy away from a challenge, seemed determined to push through. He knew he had to keep things moving, but for the first time that evening, he felt like he was walking on thin ice. Keanu wasn't the same easygoing guest he had always been in the past. Something was different, and Jimmy could sense it. "So, Keanu," Jimmy began again, his voice a little more cautious this time. "Let's talk about something else. You've been in the business for a long time. What's the hardest part about being an actor? Is it the pressure of constantly being in the public eye? Or is it more about the roles you choose?" Keanu leaned back in his chair slightly, his fingers tapping the armrest in a rhythm that seemed almost contemplative. He didn't rush to answer. He took his time, as he often did when he spoke about anything important. It was clear that the question, though seemingly simple, was something he had thought about before. "The hardest part, I think, is finding balance," Keanu said slowly, his voice calm but thoughtful. "The work itself is demanding, but it's the balance between being an actor and being a person that can be challenging. You put so much of yourself into a role, and sometimes it's hard to separate that from who you are off-screen." Jimmy nodded, trying to follow the rhythm of the conversation. "Yeah, I get that. It's like you leave a part of yourself behind every time you finish a movie." Keanu's eyes met Jimmy's for a moment, and then he looked down at his hands, almost as if considering how much he wanted to reveal. "It's more than just leaving a part behind. It's about understanding who you are after the role is over. Sometimes you're changed by the experience. You carry a piece of that character with you, whether you want to or not." Jimmy, sensing that he was stepping into deeper waters, shifted his posture and tried to ease the conversation back to a lighter tone. "Well, you've done some pretty intense roles. I mean, the John Wick movies are nothing short of legendary. How do you prepare for a role like that? Do you do any special training or get into some crazy headspace?" Keanu's expression softened just a little, but the calmness in his voice didn't waver. "For John Wick, it's about more than just physical preparation. It's about understanding the emotions of the character. The violence in the film comes from a place of loss, and that's what makes it so intense. The action scenes are just a byproduct of that emotional journey." Jimmy chuckled as though he was relieved to hear Keanu talk about the role in a more familiar way. "Yeah, it's not just the fighting, right? There's some real depth to that character. He's not just a guy with a gun. There's a lot more going on under the surface." Keanu nodded, his expression remaining steady. "Exactly. It's about the pain and the grief that drive him. The fight scenes are a way for him to process all of that, even if it's not the healthiest way." The conversation, though still somewhat serious, felt like it was finding a rhythm again. But then, almost out of nowhere, Jimmy asked a question that shifted the entire atmosphere in the room. "You know, Keanu," Jimmy said, his voice taking on a more teasing tone, "I've got to ask. You've built this whole public image of being the nice guy in Hollywood. Everyone loves you for that. But do you ever get frustrated with people constantly putting you on that pedestal? I mean, no one's perfect, right?" Keanu's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something that could have been frustration or maybe just a weariness from years of dealing with the same questions. It was subtle, but it was there. "I don't think about it too much," Keanu replied, his tone measured. "The thing is, I don't go out of my way to create an image. I just try to be myself. If people see me as kind or generous, then that's great. But I don't think it's healthy to get too caught up in what people think of you. I'm just living my life doing the best I can." Jimmy seemed to sense that he had pushed a little too hard. He tried to laugh it off, but there was a hint of tension in his voice now. "Oh, of course. I mean, who wouldn't want to be known as the nicest guy in Hollywood, right?" Keanu didn't smile. "That's not really the point, Jimmy. It's not about being the nicest guy, it's about being genuine. People in this industry can get lost in their own hype, but I try to stay grounded, stay true to who I am. The room fell quiet. Jimmy, normally quick with a comeback, found himself at a loss for words. There was something about the way Keanu said it, so calm, so grounded, that made it clear he wasn't playing along with the usual game. This wasn't just an actor talking about his career. This was a man who had clearly thought long and hard about the way he was perceived and had no interest in being anyone but himself. For a moment, Jimmy didn't know what to say. He had expected to keep the conversation light, full of jokes and laughter, but now it felt like he was in deeper than he had anticipated. It wasn't that Keanu was angry. It was just that the actor had an unshakable resolve about who he was, and it made Jimmy's usual antics seem out of place. Jimmy cleared his throat and forced a smile. Okay, I get it. No more nice guy questions. Let's just get back to the fun stuff. But Keanu didn't seem interested in moving on. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes steady on Jimmy. You know, Jimmy, sometimes the way people view you isn't always up to you. I've learned that over the years. People see what they want to see, and there's not much you can do about it. Jimmy, who had always prided himself on his ability to steer a conversation, suddenly felt like the roles had reversed. It was as though Keanu, the man who had always been quiet and reserved, was now the one who was steering this interview into uncharted waters. And sometimes, Keanu continued, his voice calm but firm, the best thing you can do is stay true to yourself and not get too caught up in what others expect of you. It's easy to lose yourself in the pressure to be something you're not. Jimmy, realizing that he wasn't going to be able to steer this conversation the way he usually did, tried one last time to lighten the mood. Well, I think it's safe to say that you figured it out better than most of us, Keanu, he said with a small laugh. But Keanu didn't laugh. Instead, he just nodded, his eyes locked on Jimmy's. I don't have it all figured out, Jimmy. I'm just trying to do the best I can with what I've got. The room was silent again, but this time it felt heavier. The audience, who had been laughing just moments ago, now seemed unsure of how to react. Jimmy, for the first time in the interview, was the one on the back foot. Keanu had turned the tables, and it wasn't just about his latest film or his public image anymore. It was about something deeper, something that neither of them could ignore. The silence in the room was now thick, almost palpable. Keanu's last words had left an impact, and Jimmy wasn't sure how to recover. His usual smoothness, the one thing that always allowed him to control the pace of his show, seemed to have evaporated. He cleared his throat, trying to find his footing again, but the weight of the moment lingered in the air. Keanu sat there, still as ever, his eyes calm and steady. It wasn't like him to be confrontational. Everyone knew that about him. But tonight something was different. Jimmy had managed to poke at something in Keanu's mind, and instead of retreating or deflecting, Keanu was holding his ground. The man who had built a career on being the kind, humble hero in every role was showing a side of himself that few had ever seen. Jimmy, sensing the need to change the subject, gave a small, nervous laugh. So, Keanu, he began, trying to lighten the atmosphere again, what do you do when you're not acting? I mean, we've talked about movies and being the nice guy, but I know you're also into motorcycles, right? You've got to have some crazy stories about that. Keanu, who had seemed so serious just a moment before, shifted slightly in his chair, his posture easing up just a little. He relaxed, but only slightly. He hadn't forgotten where the conversation had gone, but he was willing to engage again. Yeah, I do ride, he said with a small nod. Motorcycles are something I've always loved. There's something about the freedom, the focus it requires. It's a different kind of peace, one that's hard to explain unless you've been on the road for a while. Jimmy, seeing this as an opportunity to steer things back into familiar territory, smiled. I bet. I can't even imagine how much freedom you must feel on that thing. I mean, the idea of Keanu Reeves, the Zen master of Hollywood, speeding down a highway on a motorcycle is pretty cool. Keanu chuckled softly at the image, the edges of his mouth lifting slightly. It's not about speeding or anything. It's about being present. Every time I ride, I'm focused on the road, on the machine, on everything around me. It's just me, the bike, and the world. It's a kind of meditation in motion. There it was. That calm, almost spiritual way Keanu spoke was back. It wasn't forced. It was just how he saw the world. Jimmy could see that this was a side of Keanu that was genuine, something that could never be faked. But even as Keanu spoke about his love for motorcycles, Jimmy couldn't shake the feeling that something still hung between them. The earlier tension had left a mark, and it wasn't something either of them could easily move past. Still, Jimmy pressed on, wanting to maintain the show's momentum. Sounds amazing. But you're a pretty private guy. Does writing give you a chance to get away from it all? I mean, with everything going on, it must be nice to have something that's just for you. Keanu's eyes softened, and for a second, it almost felt like he was looking past Jimmy, as though recalling a memory. It's not just about escaping, he said slowly. It's about feeling grounded. In a way, it reminds me that no matter what happens, I'm still just a person. I don't need the world to see me as anything more than that. Jimmy nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the interview was veering away from the light-hearted tone he was used to. Sure, Keanu's words were interesting, profound even, but they were also difficult to navigate. Jimmy had a job to do, and that was to keep the show moving, to keep it entertaining. But tonight, Keanu wasn't making it easy. Right, Jimmy said, trying to get back on track. I can't imagine how difficult it must be to stay grounded with everything that's going on. You're a star, Keanu, a huge one, and sometimes people forget that even the biggest stars are just regular people too. Keanu gave a small shrug, his fingers lightly tapping the armrest again. I think that's the problem, Jimmy. People forget that we're all just regular people. The moment you become something more in the public eye, you lose sight of who you really are, and that can be dangerous. It's easy to get lost in that. For the first time that night, Jimmy paused before responding. It wasn't like him to be at a loss for words, but something about what Keanu had said made him rethink the entire conversation. He wasn't just interviewing a Hollywood actor anymore. He was speaking to a man who had thought deeply about the very nature of fame and its effect on a person's identity. Jimmy let out a quiet breath before continuing. I guess I can see that. But you're Keanu Reeves. You're in movies like The Matrix and John Wick. You're not just any actor. People expect things from you. So how do you deal with the pressure? I mean, does it ever get overwhelming? Keanu's gaze never left Jimmy's face, but his expression was unreadable. The pressure is always there, he said softly. But I've learned to manage it. I don't let it control me. If I did, I'd lose myself. The trick is to stay focused on the work itself, on what's meaningful. Everything else, the fame, the expectations, those are distractions. They pull you away from what really matters. Jimmy wasn't sure what to say anymore. Keanu's words were so direct, so full of purpose that they left little room for the usual banter. It was as if the veil had been lifted, and the audience, along with Jimmy, was seeing the man behind the actor. And this version of Keanu, the one who was focused, calm, and grounded, was both captivating and, in a way, a little intimidating. The tension that had been building throughout the interview wasn't about anger or frustration. It was about something deeper, something that Keanu had spent years cultivating, his own peace, his own understanding of the world. And now, as the interview reached its peak, Jimmy felt like he was an outsider trying to navigate a conversation with someone who was operating on a completely different wavelength. The silence in the room was thick again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was almost reverential. The audience was mesmerized by the exchange, even though it was clear that Jimmy wasn't sure how to keep things light anymore. The usual rhythm of the show had been disrupted, and no amount of jokes or quick wit could bring it back. Finally, Jimmy spoke, his voice quieter than before. So what's next for you, Keanu? I mean, what's the next step in this journey? You've done so much already, but there's always more, right? Keanu looked at him for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. I'm always looking for the next challenge, he said quietly, but not in the way people might think. It's not about bigger projects or more fame. It's about finding things that resonate with me, things that push me to grow. That's what keeps me going. Jimmy nodded slowly, a small smile appearing on his face. You know, I've interviewed a lot of people, Keanu, but there's something different about you. I think it's safe to say you're not like the others. Keanu's lips curled into a brief smile, though it was subtle. Maybe that's because I'm not trying to be like anyone else. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Jimmy couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the simplicity, yet depth of Keanu's outlook on life. He had spent years in the entertainment industry surrounded by egos, chaos, and distractions, yet here was a man who had managed to stay grounded, despite everything. It wasn't just about acting, it was about something more. As the interview came to a close, Jimmy finally found his footing again. Well, Keanu, I have to say this has been one of the most interesting interviews I've ever had. It's not every day you get to sit down with someone who sees the world the way you do. Keanu gave him a small, genuine smile. Thanks, Jimmy, I appreciate the opportunity to talk. The crowd clapped, but the atmosphere was different now. It wasn't the usual lively applause for a funny or entertaining interview. It was a more subdued appreciation for the conversation that had just unfolded. The show may have been wrapping up, but the impact of this conversation was far from over. As Jimmy said his goodbyes and the cameras began to roll away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for Keanu that went beyond the usual admiration for a movie star. He had come into the interview expecting to follow a script, to have a playful back and forth with one of Hollywood's most beloved figures. Instead, he had found himself in the presence of someone who had built his life on authenticity, on finding peace in a world that often seemed anything but peaceful. And as the show concluded, Jimmy knew one thing for sure: this was an interview that would stay with him for a long time. The night after the interview, Jimmy sat in his dressing room, replaying the conversation in his mind. He had done hundreds of interviews over the years with all kinds of celebrities, but this one felt different. There had been a certain weight to it, something deeper than the usual jokes and stories about movie sets. It wasn't just about the person Keanu played in films, or even the roles that had made him a household name. It was about the man himself, and in that moment, Jimmy realized that Keanu Reeves was much more than he had ever imagined. Jimmy knew the next day's headlines would be full of the usual buzz about the latest guest appearance, but something told him this interview would stand out. It wasn't because of the usual quirks or amusing anecdotes. It was because the audience had witnessed something raw, something that wasn't easy to capture on television. It was a glimpse into the soul of a man who had found peace in a chaotic world, a man who had chosen to live life on his terms, despite the pressure and the public's expectations. As the days passed, the story of the interview made the rounds, not just in the entertainment industry, but in various online communities too. Fans, journalists, and even casual viewers who had tuned in found themselves reflecting on the conversation. Many took to social media to discuss the rare moment of honesty and humility that Keanu had shown. It wasn't just about the words he had spoken. It was about the way he made people feel. Keanu, for his part, didn't make much of the buzz. He wasn't someone who sought out attention or validation from the public. He had never been one for the spotlight, and he certainly didn't let the hype from the interview go to his head. Instead, he continued on with his life, focusing on the things that mattered to him. He kept riding his motorcycle, kept working on projects that spoke to his heart, and kept his personal life private. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate his fans, far from it. He just didn't let the noise of fame distract him from the things that were important. That's why, after the interview, he didn't rush to read the online comments or seek out the latest news about the show. He knew that his true value wasn't measured by the opinions of others. It was something much deeper, something he had built over a lifetime of experiences and choices. Meanwhile, Jimmy found himself thinking more and more about the man who had been sitting across from him. The interview had started out like any other, lighthearted, fun, and filled with jokes, but as it progressed, something had shifted. Keanu's words had dug deeper than expected, and it had left an imprint on Jimmy. The questions that had once seemed like simple, passing inquiries now felt like they had unearthed something significant. It wasn't just about fame or the public eye. It was about how a person could stay true to themselves in a world that constantly asked for more. Jimmy couldn't help but respect that. It wasn't easy to be someone who rejected the idea of fame for the sake of fame. Someone who had never let the pressures of Hollywood turn him into something he wasn't. In many ways, Keanu had managed to carve out a space for himself that felt authentic, even in an industry known for its superficiality. It was a quality that Jimmy admired, and one that he knew not many could claim to have. As the week went on, Jimmy's show continued to produce its usual blend of celebrity interviews and entertainment news. But every now and then, during moments of quiet reflection, he would think back to that interview with Keanu and the way it had changed his perspective. He had spent so much of his career focused on making the audience laugh or keeping things lighthearted. But now he realized there was value in digging a little deeper, in pushing past the surface and allowing for those moments of true connection. For a brief moment, Jimmy found himself wondering if the world needed more people like Keanu, those who refused to be swept away by the demands of fame, people who weren't afraid to stand firm in their values, no matter how much the world tried to pull them in different directions. And maybe, just maybe, that's what had made this interview so different. It wasn't just about the man himself. It was about the example he set for others to follow. Back in Keanu's world, life went on as usual. He was back to work, back to focusing on his craft, and back to his quiet, simple existence. But he knew that something had shifted within him too. The interview had been a rare opportunity for him to share his thoughts about fame, personal identity, and how to stay true to oneself in a world that often feels like it's constantly shifting. Keanu had always been careful with his words, never eager to reveal too much about his private life. But that night something had felt right about opening up, even if just a little. He didn't regret it. In fact, he felt a sense of peace afterward, knowing that he had been honest not just with Jimmy but with himself. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this interview had been an important reminder. It was a reminder that, in this industry, it was easy to get caught up in the showmanship, the flashing lights, and the applause. But at the end of the day, it was the inner work, the quiet moments, the self-awareness that made all the difference. In the days that followed, Keanu found himself reflecting on the larger message that had come from that interview. It wasn't just about him. It was about the importance of maintaining a sense of authenticity in a world that often tried to dictate who a person should be. And maybe that was what he had been trying to say all along, that fame didn't define him, and it shouldn't define anyone. By now, people had begun to see Keanu in a new light, not just as the action hero or the lovable star, but as someone who had found a way to navigate the storm of fame with grace. Fans appreciated him even more for it, and the world seemed to have taken notice. But Keanu didn't need the recognition. He wasn't in it for that. He was in it for something more personal, something that only he truly understood. In the end, the interview had done more than just entertain or offer insight into his career. It had served as a moment of reflection, both for Keanu and for those who had watched it. It had reminded everyone that it was okay to be yourself, to not let the expectations of others dictate how you lived your life. And maybe that was the most powerful message of all. As Jimmy sat back in his studio that night reviewing the feedback, he couldn't help but think about the lasting impact that interview had created. It wasn't just a segment on his show. It was a conversation that resonated on a deeper level, and in a way, that was what made the world of entertainment so powerful. Sometimes the most impactful moments weren't the ones that made the biggest splash in the headlines. They were the ones that quietly shifted the way people thought, the ones that stayed with you long after the show ended. Jimmy knew that this interview with Keanu would be one he would remember for a long time. It had been a moment of truth, one that went beyond the usual banter and jokes. It had been a reminder that the people we admire, the celebrities we look up to, are just like us. They have their struggles, their own internal battles, and their own journeys to walk. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made Keanu Reeves so remarkable. He had never lost sight of that truth.